there's an arrogance that in Silicon Valley is where all the talent exists, and it's just not true.
So Darius, why are so many founders confused about where to source AI engineers?
Yeah, I think the reason is because they're just tough to find, right? The experienced ones are tough to find. And there's a lot of demand in US, Canada, really worldwide. So the supply is an issue. But I think to answer your question in the context of Latin America, I think that the primary issue is most people don't have experience hiring in Latin America, right? And so, it's a huge region. What country do we go to, right? And it's a hard answer if you don't have any experience there. Most people know that there's a lot of value in terms of the talent itself, but not having experience in the region with it being different from the domestic markets, it can just be tough to know exactly where to go. But I mean, that's where we come in to help.
What are the five factors you use to compare this region?
So the key things, right, as we think about what regions to hire, you want to look for level of English proficiency. So everywhere, every region has people that speak English in their country, right? But how many people they have, right? And so we look at that. We look at what they're training. One good indicator is the amount of startup activity that they have, because the engineers have an opportunity to get training from entry level positions, learn the ropes, what it's like to work inside of technology, and really at technology firms with high bar for quality. We also look at compensation levels. So different countries have different costs of living and have different demands on the talent. We also look at, to the extent that it becomes important for companies that want to hire full-time employees versus contractors, we need to look at the legal element of it. So what are the laws within the country, and how do we handle payroll? So those are just a few things. There's a number of things that we look at depending on what's going to be important to the particular company.
Okay, and what makes LatAm strong for AI hiring?
For AI hiring specifically, you don't have to listen to me. Andrew Ng put his stamp of approval on particularly Colombia for hiring, but I think the history of development in technology goes back further than what people expect. You've got markets like Costa Rica and Argentina that have a long history in software development. Colombia has always been an innovative region, right? In 2012, in fact, won most innovative country. Well, it was Medellin won most innovative city, which is insane because that was so long ago. I think the challenge that most people have in thinking about Latin America is they just don't have enough exposure and understand that there are very talented people. The same way that tourism across Latin America blew up because of the pandemic and the interest in traveling abroad amongst US and even Canadian travelers, the same thing happened as we think about talent. When we started to look at remote work, it was more about like, well, if we can look at remote work as a business strategy, can we also look at nearshore talent? Right. And so as people got more exposure to international markets, you know, obviously Middle East and Eastern Europe was exciting to people, but that's been the case for a while. But it started to become more clear that Latin America being within the same time zone as US and Canada is like, hey, you need to look there as well. And people discovered, wow, there's actually a lot of really good talent in the market that we should tap into.
And what about Eastern Europe?
Eastern Europe is a really good region for talent too. In fact, Eastern Europe, as well as some countries in the Middle East, were like the first place that companies went when they wanted to have offshore talent, right? So you've got your offshore, which I would consider Eastern Europe, Middle East, and then you got your nearshore if we're talking about companies in North America, and that is Latin America, right? So nearshore is going to be Latin America. I think it's a great market. I think what you end up running into is time zone issues. So if you're already in Europe, incredible market to be in, right? It just geography becomes a major deciding factor, and even more specific than geography is time zone. So how closely can our teams work together. So I think Eastern Europe has a lot of great talent. I think Middle East has a lot of great talent. Then it becomes more about how do we begin to work together as a team, which is where nearshore starts to make a ton more sense for North American companies.
Okay, and in the case of Southeast Asia.
Southeast, oh, same story. Same story, right? I would say the same thing would be true for Southeast Asia. See, here's the thing, and I don't know why we have this arrogance in North America. It's like, well, because, Silicon Valley, and I wouldn't even say all across North America, right? There's an arrogance that in Silicon Valley is where all the talent exists, and it's just not true, right? Like, someone can learn any craft anywhere, just given that, especially in AI, the traditional institutions that you would go to learn a particular craft, they're not the ones who are always leading in the ability to train. And so, really, talent exists everywhere. And so, if you take those blinders off, then you realize that, hey, I could look anywhere across the world. I'm looking for someone who has the right makeup from an intellectual horsepower perspective. And that does not only exist in one region. And it's funny because we recognize it in sports, right? Sports, you don't just say, hey, we only want basketball players from Chicago. You're like, no, we got to go to Italy. We got to go to China. People can be talented from all over the world and compete with the best.
Okay, and side by side scorecard.
Side by side in Latin America, what would I say? Okay, let me get the top. It's hard to say which one is the best. They all have their differences, right? Costa Rica has a long history in software development, fewer people, but they do have very strong English speaking capabilities, great universities. Colombia, new player to the market, relatively new, right? But large population, long history in innovation and technology, not quite as mature from the perspective of English speaking population, but that's changing rapidly, right? Mexico, more expensive, but also a very mature technology market from a software development and AI perspective. Then you've also got Argentina and Brazil. Brazil, also a place where you'll see a lot of cost efficiencies. They have a really mature business environment, right? So if you think about Sao Paulo, really mature business environment. And in fact, a lot of folks from Latin America end up going to Brazil to do business, right? Obviously, they speak an entirely different language than Spanish. They speak Portuguese, but that's not our focus here. We're looking at people who are like bilingual English and something else, whether it be Portuguese or Spanish. So Brazil's a great market as well. And then, of course, Argentina is really good. A lot of great English speakers. One of the older markets as it relates to software technology talent. And Chile, I would throw in there as well. So they're all good for their own reasons. It just depends on the strategy. But I would say, in terms of the highest growth market, Colombia is going to be the highest growth market as the newer player. And then I would say, in terms of the most mature market with the most candidates, it's going to be Brazil.
Okay, and is there ever a case for Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia?
Yeah, the case for Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia is if you are in that time zone, right? Yeah, go. That's a better decision than Latin America. If I have a business in Eastern Europe, if I have a business in Southeast Asia, I'm probably better than hiring within that geographic, what is it, longitude. So, but I think the importance I'm placing on time zone is real time communication. And so, if we're talking about AI, it's experimental in many ways. Whether we're talking about a product that has already been tested and we know it works, AI is still experimental from the perspective that it is probabilistic and we have to improve our models. We could also be working on technologies that are not tested and have not gone into production in a significant way, which also makes it experimental. But those things require a higher level of communication and more. I don't want to wait 12 hours to get an answer. I want to get an answer immediately. I also don't want to be up at 4 in the morning talking to, well, I'm a little bit different, but you guys are looking at me like, oh, but most people don't want to be awake crazy hours just so that they can connect with the team, right? So real-time communication becomes a real value add and a productivity lever.
What would you do if you were hiring your first AI pod today?
Okay. If I was hiring an AI pod, just meaning that I wanted to select a group, so it depends. I can tell you what I would do. Obviously, I'm going to hire in Latin America, right? Obviously, I would hire in Colombia. Medellin is a great city that, see, here's the interesting thing. If you hire in Colombia, Medellin is a city that everyone wants to be. So they could be in Bogota, they can be in Cali, they could be in Santa Marta, they could be wherever. But if you say, hey, do you want to go to Medellin? They'll want to go to Medellin. So, but in general, let's just say I'm a company and I'm hiring talent that is offshore and nearshore. If it's offshore, I want to have an expert that's there. So, and this is where we've seen a lot of people go wrong. They'll have a team in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and have an offshore talent in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East. But the thing is, you have to have leadership that you trust there to make sure that the team is always working at the level of quality and with the level of, passion's probably not the right word, but discipline. The challenge when you have an offshore team in a different time zone is that you don't have the connectivity to that team for them to be working at the right cadence, to have the right level of focus, and you end up dropping balls, right? It's a little bit easier when you can work with a nearshore team just because the remote work technologies have made it a lot easier to work with nearshore teams that are remote in the same time zone, right? And still have the same cadence, the same discipline that you would have in an in-office environment. It's harder to have that when people are literally working on opposite schedules. So to come back to what I would do is I would have a strategy where I'm hiring the best I can find, no matter where they live, right? And obviously within the budget that I would be able to afford, right? I may want to hire Facebook's best engineer, but I don't have $5 million to be. I don't have $5 million to pay them annually, right?
And what is the biggest mistake that the founders make when they are choosing a region?
I think what I alluded to earlier is selecting a region where you don't have the ability to have live communication, hiring talent there, and not having leadership that is in that same time zone to help manage the talent. I think that is a mistake. That's where a lot of balls get dropped. The other mistake I would say, there's a narrative around in office being the better solution. The mistake I think people are making when they assume in office is a better solution is one, there're just a lot of really talented people that don't and won't work in office, right? So now you're eliminating a large group of potential talent. So that's one. Two, I think that the inability to effectively manage a remote team is a management issue, right? So people say remote doesn't work. No, your management skills just aren't good enough for it to work. But certainly there are organizations that have developed that management skill, the systems to make remote work really well. And so I think at a high level, right, people, oh, remote work doesn't work. Everyone needs to be in office. It creates a different environment. It makes people more productive. Do you really think people don't fake work while they're in the office? Do you really think that people don't pretend and take random breaks and, all of the same things people do at their home, they also do in office, right? But we fool ourselves because that's the narrative out there. So I think it really, as you think about building a team, whether it's in office or remote, the ability to manage becomes very important.